Stand Grab, we're going to get to your questions on the international response to Afghanistan, separating the art from the artist, and the influence of political leaders past and present. Now, here to give you some answers, Emmy award-winning actor Brian Cox, who's in Australia for the Melbourne Writers' Festival and Antidote in Sydney. Artistic Director of Short Black Opera, Deborah Cheetham. Singer-songwriter Marlon Williams, who will also be performing a little later on. Author and Veterans Advisor Catherine McGregor, and photojournalist and author Andrew Quilty. Please make them all feel welcome.
What is the role of artists and celebrities in raising issues of public importance? What part do you want to play in telling stories to raise particular issues? Do celebrity opinions carry more weight with decision makers than those of the average citizen?
Brian.
I think you've always got to be contentious. I think that's the most important thing, and you really have to stand up for yourself politically. We get a bad reputation, actors. They say, how dare actors speak about certain things that we're not supposed to understand. But then our job is about understanding that. If we're playing somebody, we've got to understand. I played a lot of parts, actually. I played Herman Goring. I played an Iron Bevan. And you couldn't get two more separate people than Herman Goring and an Iron Bevan who created the National Health Service, and Herman Goring, who created Adolf Hitler. So you can't get anything more extraordinary than that. And therefore, you have to inhabit that. And by inhabiting it, you understand what the process is. You understand what it's about. And that's why you form, and it's through that you form political opinion. And political opinion is important. I've gone through all kinds of changes politically. I was a great socialist. I did the Voice of Labour in the UK in 1997. I helped get Tony Blair elected.
Then you realised Labour wasn't socialist.
Well, Labour was not at all socialist. And social democracy was failing, particularly at the time of Iraq. And what Blair did in Iraq was disgraceful. The act of hubris was ridiculous. And I decided, where do I go now? Where is social democracy alive and well? And ironically, it was back in my home country of Scotland. There's an amazing woman called Nicola Sturgeon, who I think is an extraordinary person. And she's leading the country. The First Minister right now, yeah. Yeah, and she's the First Minister. And hopefully we're going to go for another referendum. They'll try and stop us, but the heart of the people wants to be free. Yeah. Like you Australians have got the big debate about monarchy, and I wish you good luck with it. But I think it's important that you stand up for your beliefs. Otherwise, what is it about? What is life about? But how we live.
Deborah, you can applaud if you want. Don't be shy. Deborah, you've done that. You refused to sing the Australian anthem when you were invited in 2015, right, for the AFL Grand Final?
Yeah.
Because of many things, I suspect, but because of the wording that we are young and free.
Yeah.
That's changed to one and free. Does that make a difference to you? Would you sing it now?
That was a dreadful change. No consultation. Change one word. What does that do? Just this week we honoured a great Australian just a couple of nights ago, Judith Durham.
Yeah.
And Judith Durham wrote a new lyric for our anthem in 2009. I helped to launch it actually at the Victorian College of the Arts, and it was beautiful. It acknowledged everyone. It acknowledged the achievements that we've made as Australians. I mean, our anthem was written in the 1800s by a Scot as a white Australia policy anthem, really. And if you look at all the other verses, they're terrible. But yeah, look, I took a stand that year. I was invited to sing the national anthem, and I just felt I couldn't anymore. I had for many years. I couldn't. So I went back to the AFL and I said, I'd be happy to sing it if I can sing Judith's lyrics. Australians, let us stand as one upon this ancient land. That's all of our inheritance, and yet we're still so far away from understanding that that's something we can share. It's not just mine as an Indigenous, as a Yorta Yorta woman. That's all of our inheritance, but it really depends on how much we understand that connection. We've got to go on that journey from perhaps not even knowing about it to knowing about it and then understanding it. And I would say, I would separate artists out from celebrities. I think that there are some artists who achieve celebrity, but they probably don't enjoy it that much. So I'd separate those two things out, and I think that's actually our remit as artists, because the arts are a way of knowing and being in the world. They're millennia old. They're central to the way we exist, the way society holds together. So I think that it's actually our duty of care as artists to society.
The pen is mightier than the sword, indicating that the written word is more effective than violence as a tool for communicating a point. But why do so many still choose to use violence, such as war, to resolve their disagreements?
Andrew.
Oof. Well, it's a very good question, and I don't think I have an answer for it. If I did, I'd probably be getting paid more than I am as a journalist. But I think it's an easy way to act upon an emotion, to act out anger. In the case of the war in Afghanistan, I think one of the first mistakes was going in as quickly as we did. Although it was a so-called legal war, it was sanctioned by the UN Security Council. I think the basis for the original invasion was too heavily predicated upon revenge, and that means that any diplomacy that could have taken effect before then wasn't given a chance. Any learning about the country and the culture and the people and the foe was not given a chance to occur, and the results speak for themselves now.
Well, you look at your work, and we're talking about words here, but you've written a book about your experience, but the power of your images as well, which often speak, as we know, more loudly than words. Did you feel as if that was getting through, as if that was a way of connecting through the violence or revealing something about the conflict?
I'd like to think that what I was able to convey in Afghanistan that was different from a lot of the photographers who'd been in Afghanistan before me and photographed the war itself, the conflict, the combat, was to show a side of Afghanistan, the side of Afghanistan that wasn't at war. The faces of people who were living alongside the conflict, living on the front lines, but who weren't themselves taking part in the conflict. I think that seems to be what resonated for those who appreciated my pictures anyway.
Catherine?
I disagree with Andrew on a point here. I think the initial military action against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda was legitimate. It was an extraordinary, not only the Security Council, I think the General Assembly, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, Pakistan and China, endorsed that action. There was an enormous degree of unanimity. The first global leader to call Bush after the attacks on the towers was Vladimir Putin. So if you look back to that world on that day, the degree of repugnance at those attacks, and Andrew is much more steeped in life in Afghanistan, and I defer to that. I don't think the Taliban were ever going to hand over AQ, and nor that I don't think it gave them any joy to accommodate them after they'd seen what he'd done either. My problem wasn't the initial strike, and I wrote it while I was inside the army, and I sponsored works by people who took this view. I don't think we should have ever gone back for the nation-building phase. I think at the Bonn conference, and Karzai was the wrong leader, I agree, that we're mirror imaging ourselves there with an urbane, corrupt individual. He was the wrong leader for Afghanistan after the Taliban were deposed. But I don't think, looking at the evidence of the Russian war there, the Soviet war there, that nation building in that society was ever going to avail us. The surgical strike, removal of the training camps, driving AQ out of, and then they could have maintained surveillance using remotely piloted systems. and local forces operating with special forces. You did not need to have the footprint we had there after 2006-7. It was a terrible mistake.
Brian, and then came Iraq, and of course you've mentioned that was part of your split with Labor. If there was a case, and certainly at the UN and after the attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, there was support for the initial invasion of Afghanistan. Iraq was a different thing, wasn't it?
Well, it's all linked. I think what we've never understood, what Lawrence tried to do, Lawrence Arabia, and even goes back further. There's a wonderful book by James Morris, now sadly no longer with us, Jan Morris, and he wrote the Pax Britannica, which was the story of the British first connection with Afghanistan and imperialism. And all of this...
The graveyard of empires.
That's right, and it is the graveyard of empires. It goes right back to trying to alter a society. When a society doesn't need altering, it needs recognising. And that's the problem that's been right from the start. So it's a knock-on effect. So the Russian war in Afghanistan, it's all been very pointless because the fundamental root of it has never been examined. You know, this is a culture that we don't always understand, and we try to change it, we try to shift it, we try to make it, we try to rationalize it in our own terms. And I think we have to begin to understand how cultures evolve. And I mean, what we did in the Middle East was dreadful. And what we did now, what Blair did and what Bush did and Cheney particularly and Donald Rumsfeld did in Iraq was horrendous because it disturbed a balance that had been created. You know, the balance between the Sunni and the Shia. And for all his horribleness, what's his name, Saddam, understood that. But also, as with all leaders, and certainly as you mentioned about the Prime Minister there is always this element of corruption. And it's the corruption that comes to the fore. And that's the tragedy of putting yourself in a position.
Coming back to the question, if I may, for a moment, though.
The pen is mightier than sword, or not?
I'd like to address that. And just as to leaving aside concepts of original sin, there's a wonderful study by a historian, Azar Gatt, who's written an anthropological survey. It's a work of great scope. We've been fighting since we were painting in caves. I don't know why. It's dispiriting, and when you talk about, as a species, are we at a point where it's bleaker than ever? I don't think the Bard would agree with you on that.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting you mentioned the Bard because, of course, wasn't it in Hamlet that many wearing rapiers are afraid of those with goose quills?
And also Fortinbras, when he sees they're going to fight over a piece of land that's, you know, nothing. And Hamlet can't understand what this extraordinary soldier is doing. And of course, it's one of the central debates in his life. You know.
Deborah, but 1/10,000 of those men in England who do no work this day.
Yeah.
Deborah, it's interesting, of course, we reflect on the Australian experience, and we're still dealing with 200 plus years of colonisation and invasion and conflict in our own land. If we're talking about the pen being mightier than the sword, what does something like a voice to Parliament, which we'll be voting on in the term of this government, deliver in terms of being able to tell the truth about history?
Yeah,
is it strong enough?
I think we have to recognise that not everybody gets a pen.
That's right.
And that's the problem, you know, and without education on how to be a society, a cohesive society, without those lessons of empathy that should spring from our humanity, and they don't. Those people who are disenfranchised because they don't have a pen will turn to the sword or be manipulated to turn to the sword. So, bring it back to... So I just wanted to say there that I think the pen is mightier than the sword, but not everybody gets one, and we have to make sure that everybody gets one. Yeah? But this point about colonisation and our journey and our voice to Parliament, look, I'm going to say it right now. This is going to be my third referendum, right? 67. Can we count you as a human being and not a plant or an animal? That was the first referendum. Marriage equality, right? Second
plebiscite,
referendum, yeah? I'm engaged to be married now. My fiancé is here, and I'm telling you, what we went through to get to that point where love is love, that was punishing. And what was it, 67.8? Got us across the line. In Aotearoa, they sang, Pokari Kariana. I wept on that day when I watched Parliament. We got it across the line, and I wanted to celebrate more, but... And now this third referendum. Okay, that's what we're going to do. But I really ask you, should I live through another referendum to tell me that I can be, that I can have a voice to Parliament? That my ancestors have poured their knowledge into this land for 2,000, generations. I'm tired of the referendums, and there may be another one on the monarchy eventually. That's another conversation for another time, but we've got to have that voice. If it's to be representational and that belonging I was talking about, that inheritance that we should all feel as Australians, really it's essential that there are first Australians in Parliament. And I'm glad to see there's a movement behind that. I just wish we didn't have to go through another referendum.
Marlon, is the pen mightier than the sword?
Well, I'm with Deborah. We both Aboriginal and Māori culture are both they're oral cultures. There's no pens in either culture.
Right.
So, and when the New Zealand land wars were taking place, violence broke down between the Crown could no longer, they couldn't impose their will. There was parity of population. There was. And just a massive resistance for Māori, and so they had to turn to the pen instead of the sword. And that's
the Treaty of Waitangi.
Yeah, yep, the Treaty of Waitangi. Well, after that, that they failed to uphold their obligations to the treaty, and then the land wars broke out, and when they broke down, sweeping confiscations and running everything through the native land court, putting everything through the courts. Where it was expensive. It was there's the law came, the power of the law came in, which is another word for the pen really, came in and took over. Yeah.
As a Māori performer, do you feel the weight of that too when you perform, and do you feel the privilege as well of the representation of Māori people?
I do. It's a responsibility, and I'm very humbled by it, but I'm very open and honestly curious about my own personal journey through being Māori and what it means to me, and it always has to be, as an artist, it always has to be inward outward, I think, and that it does come in conflict sometimes when you're representative of seem to be representing a culture, because no one can do that fully. That no single person can do that.
So true.
So I have a responsibility to myself first as an artist, and then as a Māori, and then on out.
While I believe language is a form of identity, and I believe in the importance of upholding it, when it comes to sharing it to the vast majority who don't speak Indigenous language, how is that message going to transpire? Shouldn't your art be more focused on telling your stories in a more universal language?
I think our Indigenous languages are the universal languages. They're the oldest in the world. They have the longest continuing culture. And I would say that the process that I undertake is to make sure that any language I'm writing in, so my own language, Yorta Yorta language, that is made accessible to the Yorta Yorta people, and in particular the Yorta Yorta children. It's really important that communities learn to be conversant in their own languages before they hear it out there in the general public. So every program that I have, it instilled in that is that the community from which the language comes will have access. That's really fundamental. I did a big project with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra a couple of years ago, they decided that they wanted to do an acknowledgement of country at every single performance. I'm sure many of you have heard this acknowledgement of country, but not only in the language of the Bunurong people, but in the language of all 9 nations on which the MSO perform. And part of the agreement in writing this piece of music and setting it to all those languages was that that would be gifted back to community so that they could learn their language. Now, I think that English is a fine language, and where would we be this evening or on any other occasion if we couldn't express ourselves in a nuanced way? What I'm fighting for is what my great-grandmother lost through the brutality of early colonisation, where her identity was taken from her, her land was taken from her. Language is formed from the geography in which it resides. So there's a very strong connection between the dispossession of land and language and the suppression of identity. So we need to bring this back. And nothing gives me more pleasure than being able to speak in a language. This evening, when Brian and I were backstage, I wanted to give acknowledgement of country because Brian and Nicole had just arrived in Australia here on the Kulin Nations, and I wanted them both to hear the language that is still in this land. And I think it's going to be a great gift for us all if we can say to guests visiting us, Wominjeka. I mean, we should all say that right now. Let's say it, Wominjeka.
Wominjeka.
Wominjeka. Or if you're on the other side of the river, Wominjeka, because we've got accents, you know. But it means...
That does lead to confusion, though.
Well, it can. Like,
This is from a Scot, mind you, talking about accents that lead to confusion.
Did you say castle or castle? I mean, let's not go there. But what Wominjeka means, or Wominjeka, Auntie Carolyn Briggs, Nawit Carolyn Briggs, taught us that it means come, state your intention, and I'll escort you through country. It's really nuanced, and I think it's something that empowers us as Australians. I know when I sing in a traditional language on the country that it comes from, if I'm up on Yorta Yorta country, down on Gunditjmara country, right here on Bunurong, Wurundjeri country, I feel so empowered when I'm speaking that language. So I think they are the original universal languages, and we all just need to get on board.
Brian, what did it feel like to be welcomed tonight when you arrived here in those languages?
Well, privileged, really, and honoured, because it's the fundament of what this land was.
And of course, where you come from as well, there has been a struggle throughout Great Britain for people's languages to be spoken.
Absolutely.
Gaelic languages, Welsh languages, Scottish languages to be spoken.
Yeah, it's always been a tricky thing. I mean, I had to speak Gaelic in a film. I don't speak Gaelic. And it's the hardest language in the world because it bears no relationship to English whatsoever. So that makes it doubly difficult to understand and doubly difficult to kind of adhere to because I've been brought up speaking English or Scots English, you know, accented. Why, mind you, where I come from, for instance, I'll give you an example. If you say, I've eaten everything, where I come from, you would say,
There you go. Hello.
That's great.
That's what it would be, but that's just lazy Dundonian speak. That's nothing sophisticated.
Do you fall back into that when you go back home? That's the way
I slip back into the accent. Well, I slip into the accent very easily when I go back home. I used to try and resist it. I have a nephew who's lived here for 40 years, and he still hasn't lost his Dundonian accent.
As a performer, you've performed with different accents. How do you do that, and what do you find in that to be authentic as well? It's the first thing people spot. We hear an American playing an Australian, and we hear them say "g'day." We know how that sounds, isn't it?
Well, I would be embarrassed. I tried to do an Australian. Well, I do an Australian accent to my wife, and then I did it the other day on the radio,
to do it for us
and it
now.
was terrible.
You've got to do it for us
No,
now.
I'm not going to do it again. No, I've done it once. I'm not going to put my head in that particular lion's mouth, quite frankly.
But how do you find that when you're performing?
Well, you do. You know, you learn it. I had to play. I'm too short, but I played LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, and he spoke in a South Texas accent. So I had somebody instructing me. I had a teacher who taught me like a piece of music. So you learn it like learning a piece of music, and then you assimilate it, and it's repetition, repetition, repetition. You repeat, 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 and you get the whole thing in you.
Do you stay in it when you're performing, when you're offset?
No, I can't be doing any of that.
Okay.
I really can't. I mean, I have a big row with certain American actors who want to have a religious experience every time they act. And I really don't want to go down that road. I believe the best actors are children. Children are the best actors. I once did a video, you can get it on YouTube. It's called Brian Cox's Masterclass with Theo, who's a 2-year-old boy. And I taught him to be or not to be. Now, he got distracted. He went everywhere. But he did things which were his own. He didn't do research, you know. He didn't research the part. He didn't do any of the nonsense that we think about. He just did it. And he did it in the most extraordinary way. And then there's a moment in it when he does the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And he did something which I didn't tell him to do. He just went, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. and it meant so much. But it was him. It was totally who he was.
In light of many recent controversies and revelations of artists across many disciplines, can you separate the art from the artist?
Brian, you had quite a few things to say about some people that you've performed with over the years in your biography that might have got you into a little bit of trouble. But can you separate the art from the artist, particularly when the artist may be in many ways repugnant?
Well, you have to have it's a discipline. You know, art and artistry is a discipline. It's always a discipline. And I've played a lot of really not very nice people. And you have to learn how to do that. And you have to learn, and you have to keep a sense of distance. That's why I don't it's pretend. That's why I always go back to the child. And I say this to when I've taught, I always remind students that they should always have a picture of themselves as a little boy or a little girl, just to remind them that that's who they are. Because fundamentally, that's who we all are. I mean, as we get older, you know, this whole carapace becomes something else. But the little boy and the little girl still dwells in us all. And it's that little boy and little girl that has to be absolutely honoured all the time.
I have to ask you, Brian, I mean, there are many here that you spoke about, but is Johnny Depp still overblown and overrated?
I never said he was overblown. I never said he was overblown. I did say he was overrated. That's a personal opinion. But do you know something? I think that Johnny Depp also thinks he's overrated.
But Marlon, when it comes to artists, if it comes to someone like Michael Jackson, of course, allegations have been made against Kevin Spacey, of course, that we've seen going through his own trials as well. Does it make us, and there have been others throughout history, but does it make us look at the artist differently or the art differently because of the artist? How do you approach that?
Well, clearly it does, but it doesn't
But you can
always.
still listen or watch?
I mean, I think everyone, and it's good that it's this way, everyone should have their own relationship with the artist and their art, you know, and everyone has to make their own decision. And if it feels wrong because they can't escape something about that person that's made that, then don't watch it, don't listen to it. It's not, no one's compelled to do anything.
Absolutely.
But obviously time is a big factor. You know, we don't really know much about Shakespeare. You know, Shakespeare's
Brian
life,
might.
but you know, I don't know enough to cancel Shakespeare. You know, and too much time has elapsed to bother. So you know, and of course this is such a intensely visible and interpenetrative society. So these questions are far more prescient than they've ever been. So yeah, it's a very hot potato.
That's all we have time for tonight. Thanks to our panel, Brian Cox, Deborah Cheetham, Marlon Williams, Catherine McGregor and Andrew Quilty.